11th of April 1940. My dear Cliff, by now you should be back at Pembroke Dock, but we feel very anxious. The news is so alarming now Germany has occupied Norway and Denmark. 2 flying boats have been lost. I am at present waiting for the news of the naval battle that has been raging around the Norwegian coast. It's all a tragic affair. They are going to broadcast a statement by Mr. Churchill at 1:15 a.m. All the love in the world. From Mother.
Throughout my childhood, my mother and grandmother told me stories about my Uncle Cliff. A daring and inventive teenager, he seemed to have achieved a lot in his 28 years. Their memories of him left a vivid impression, and I think I always knew when the time was right, I would return to those stories and try and find out more about my uncle's short and eventful life. Look at that. That is absolutely fantastic. It's the coast of Norway. That's what he was looking at when he flew over here in April 1940. I've seen pictures of these gravestones for so long, and I never really knew I'd ever really get to see them.
Dear friends and people of Silling, it is now 45 years since the 9th of April 1940 brought us together. The day when the tranquility of your village was shattered by the advent of war, the horrors of which were made manifest in the form of some 30 tons of burning molten aircraft crushed in Silling's Overskogen. 10 young men were the victims of that moment of war. 9 killed. I was the only survivor of that tragic Easter night, when, after great fear and loneliness and pain, in desperation I called to my God for help. The miracle happened. My cries were heard. Johann Broughton was my good Samaritan, and I thank him for his great Christian spirit and the 45 years of life he gave me to enjoy with my wife and family. Our heartfelt, sincerest thanks, Ogwyn George.
I found a copy of the letter to Silling Church from Welshman Ogwyn George in a box of papers left to me by my mother. The box also contained scrapbooks, newspaper cuttings, photographs, redolent of the excitement of an earlier age when aviation was in its infancy. But Ogwyn's letter drew my attention to other sombre reports. My uncle, Cliff Carpenter, was one of 9 Commonwealth airmen who perished when their Sunderland warplane exploded and crashed late one afternoon over Norway. In time, my grandmother would form a warm friendship with Ogwyn, the Sunderland's sole survivor, for he was the last link to her beloved son. His letter was a fragment of Cliff's life, of the promise spoken of and lost to his grieving family, a starting point for a journey I would take to find the uncle I never met. The 10 airmen vanished on a reconnaissance flight over Norway in what many at the time thought would be a very short war. Cliff Carpenter was born in Brisbane, Australia on Christmas Day 1911. His American grandfather had been a whaling captain and adventurer who had sailed the Pacific Ocean from its northern ice boundary to the Antarctic. However, in 1863, after the American Civil War spelled ruin for many whalers, he severed his connection with the United States and became a naturalised British subject, moving his family of 5 sons and a daughter to Australia. Cliff's father, Jack Carpenter, became a successful businessman, rising through the ranks of the Pacific Trading Company Burns Philp to become general manager in Wellington, New Zealand. It was here at Lyndham Terrace, in the southernmost capital of the world, 7-year-old Cliff came to live with his family. Encouraged at home and at school, he would experiment with the new inventions that World War I had advanced: radio and aviation. By 1919, men had been flying for less than 20 years. Exhausted by the Great War, victors and vanquished alike did not have the means or the will to develop military aviation. It was the airmen, anxious to turn their aviation skills to civilian use, who blazed a trail in the 1920s for the technological explosion of the 1930s. Breaking records in flimsy aeroplanes of canvas and wood, aviators captured the imagination of the world. Ewan Dixon flew Cook Strait in a war surplus biplane connecting the North and South Islands of New Zealand. Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic solo, and in June 1928, Australian Charles Kingsford Smith, in a sensational flight, became, in the words of an American reporter, the aerial Columbus of the Pacific. And just 4 months later, he flew the Tasman to circle triumphantly over Wellington. For the first time, radio had allowed an enthralled public to track and share the excitement of these epic flights. I imagine my uncle and his schoolmates would have waved and cheered with the population of Wellington that day as he witnessed the future. Taking over the backyard of the family home, he started work on his first aeroplane from plans out of an American magazine and dreamt of flying it.
It is good to live in times like these. It is easy to imagine that a sense of impending achievement thrilled the Elizabethan in the same way when men went forth in ships. Today, they go forth in ships of another kind, and their adventuring holds the attention of their fellows with a similar intensity. Brisbane Daily Telegraph.
At the same time, on the other side of the world, the Welshman Cliff would not meet for another 11 years, would begin his life in very different circumstances.
He had quite a sad upbringing when he was younger because his mum died at childbirth with his brother. So he was brought up by her sisters and family because his father remarried and he didn't get on with his stepmother. So he went to live with his mum's sister and then again up to Bristol to his grandmother. He was forced to leave the grammar school because of home circumstances, and he went to work underground in the pit.
For many young men in the hard Depression years, the Air Force offered adventure and travel, and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fly. On the eve of the Depression and nearing retirement, Cliff's father Jack brought his family back to Australia. The austerity and hardship of the 1929 Depression would bring an end to an exciting decade of freedom. However, Cliff was fortunate as his prudent father was able to shield his family from the worst of the economic disaster that had engulfed the world. He immersed himself in gliding and aeronautics studies at East Sydney Technical College, his attention captured by the all-metal monoplanes emanating from Europe and America. With the help of 3 friends, he designed and built his second aircraft, a single-engine cabin monoplane.
And it was quite a progressive-looking aircraft. He obviously had some backing. I don't know what the family was like at that stage, but the Carpenters, I think, were fairly well off even then.
On Christmas Day 1932, his 21st birthday, Cliff took his newly completed but as yet untested plane to Quakers Hill, northwest of Sydney, to attend a gathering of home-built aircraft. It was there it had its first unofficial flight. He carried out a number of taxi runs with friends as passengers, and on one of them he found himself heading for a water hole. So rather than crashing into the hole and possibly damaging his aircraft, he decided to apply power and took off. Well, once in the air, he found it impossible to get back down again. So he was forced to improvise a little and eventually made an effective but rather heavy landing.
He got down all right, but in getting out of the aircraft, that was it. He apparently had a bit of a mental block, threw himself on the ground just as his mother and father drove up from Sydney. That was the only time he flew the aircraft.
Cliff's home built was finally approved for flight 1 month later. However, it was deemed experimental, so was unusable for its purpose, to give him the hours for his commercial licence, the much coveted B licence. He never flew it again. He sold it to a wine firm as an advertising prop. It was placed nose down and achieved some fame over the years as the crashing plane, familiar to Sydney-siders on the Great Western Highway.
I was building up hours for my commercial licence, so a long flight appealed to me. And so I looked around to find an aircraft, and Palmer had the Red Rose. He offered to hire it to me, and then he thought twice about it, I think, and thought it'd be a good idea if he could get his friend Cliff Carpenter to go along as co-pilot, because he wasn't too sure of my flying. Cliff agreed to come along. I'd known him just around the airport and seen him. He was one of the, what I call playboy pilots. He loved flying and he flew for the fun of it and thoroughly enjoyed it.
To build up his hours and thus acquire his commercial licence, he hired aeroplanes and planned long flights.
Mother flies with son. It is every mother's ambition to see her son rise in the world, but not often does she have the opportunity of rising with him. When her son Clifford, who recently gained his pilot's licence, made his first long-distance flight from Sydney to Brisbane, in spite of an inward shiver, she told her son she would fly with him. Mrs. Carpenter is a modern mother. She enters into her children's studies and sport with her own bright individuality. On the way home, the Bluebird flew over the Eleanora golf links, low enough for Mrs. Carpenter to wave to her usual foursome.
By the early 1930s, independence became possible for the aviator with the production of the small, affordable Gypsy Moth. A young person could become a pilot for hire and reward.
How I paid for my flying is by charging for flights. I made a job for myself, visiting country shows and race meetings where I could land a Gypsy Moth. It was the first commercial flying I did.
Sydney's mascot aerodrome was a small, vibrant community where everybody knew everybody. But in the lean depression years, the airmen were finding it hard to stay aloft. Seeing an opportunity, Cliff joined the aircraft repair business of Leo Turl and Frank Gannon. They decided to consolidate their meagre resources and, with a confident flourish, founded Toogan Aircraft Limited. A well-regarded aircraft designer, Lawrence Wackett, was approached. Wackett wanted to build a new aeroplane, and Cliff and his brother Warren convinced their father and some business associates to back Toogan. Warren Carpenter raised the balance of the funds from amongst his friends. Toogan became the first company to series produce Australian-designed and built aircraft. It manufactured 8 Gannets, a high-wing twin-engine monoplane suitable for both military and civil services.
Anyone with experience of Australian-built aircraft will readily admit that the workmanship in an Australian plane is equal to anything put out by any other craftsman in the world. I am, etc., J.C. Carpenter.
By 1936, the small company was flourishing, employing 50 people in its factory at Mascot. Toogan went on to form the nucleus of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, which made it possible for the RAAF to engage in World War II as a fighting service. However, despite the success of this venture, my uncle's first love was flying, and another way to pay the bills was to become a daring showman on the weekends. Carpenter's aerial circus took to the skies, barnstorming Eastern Australia with spectacular displays, parachute jumps, aerial dogfights and joyrides. For an enthralled but sceptical public, there was a serious side to the circus mayhem.
My object, therefore, is to show you how safe an aeroplane is and how an aeroplane has changed from an unwieldy contraption for fools and millionaires to an everyday utility, serving the public and making another step in the progress of civilization. Yours faithfully, Cliff Carpenter, organising pilot.
The Griffith Aerial Pageant, arranged by Carpenter's Aerial Circus. See expert pilots defying the laws of gravity, aerobatics, crazy flying, aerial dogfights, and dead-shot sharpshooter bomber Air Commodore Peter Nokomovsky. He never misses. Marvel at Flight Lieutenant Reese's amazing parachute jump and the Hoop of Fire. The first time in Australia the feat has been attempted. Joyriding all weekend. Adults 1 shilling, children 6pence. This Saturday and Sunday. Don't miss it.
We used to go to the Hydro for holidays. Well, this particular time was about halfway between Christmas and New Year, and just to keep things moving, they had a fancy dress dance. I had a costume my sister had used in a musical comedy, White Horse Inn, and she'd been one of the village girls, the chorus girls. So I'd borrowed that, and we'd been busy ironing it before dinner. When I went to take the iron back, the shop had shut. So we had dinner, and then after we got ready, and I was ready first. I said, oh, I'll take the iron back to the office. And I walked into this office kiosk place. There was a tall young man standing there looking very glum. He'd been asking, where is everyone? The dining room was crowded, but there's no one around. And she said, oh, they've all gone, probably getting ready for the fancy dress dance, which hadn't impressed him at all. And she said, oh, no, he didn't have to get dressed up if he didn't want to. He could still go to it. No. And about that time, I walked in the door in my peasant girl outfit with a full skirt and blouse with puff sleeves and waistband with lacing in the front. And he just turned round and stared and continued to stare while I gave her back the iron and said what had happened. And as I walked out the door, I heard him say, oh, well, perhaps I'll go to the dance after all.
For months, I'd been longing to meet someone who may have flown with Cliff, or at least known him. The chances were slim, as my uncle had died such a long time ago. I placed my request in the RSVP section of the Sydney Morning Herald. I had heard that Cliff had become engaged shortly before he was killed, so I added, I would also like to contact Isabel Wilson or her family. Incredibly, she rang at 9:30 the morning the piece was published. She said it was as though she'd been waiting 70 years to be contacted. I
spread the paper out on the kitchen bench, and I just stood and looked at it. And it jumped right out of the page. I didn't see anything else except Jack Clifford, Cliff Carpenter. Now I thought, what do they want to know? What do I want to know? Finally, down the end, I found they wanted to find Isabel Wilson.
I asked her what she thought were Cliff's achievements, and I remember her saying, I think the sheer persistence of the early airmen against all odds is what struck me most about them. They believed aviation had a tremendous future.
I just said he was basically a happy person, although he had frustrated ambitions because he couldn't get as much flying as he liked and there weren't the opportunities here. They were just beginning to open up, but he hadn't found any at that stage. He went to Queensland to flying in New Zealand, so there were not immediately around Sydney where his family lived.
I remember your son Cliff was one of my best pilots and also a close friend, and I followed his career closely. It was with regret I learned of his unfortunate death. Only a few of my boys survived the war, I think because they were all such a daring bunch. But it was always sad news when I heard of the loss of any of them. Kindest regards, Tom MacDonald.
In an era when land-based aerodromes were few and oceans wide, flying boats had ventured forth with passengers and mail on long-distance routes to connect the empire.
The large aircraft in the 1920s and the 30s were the flying boats because they operated from open areas of sheltered waters, and we had a classic area of that in Milford Haven here. And they were able to go longer and further than the other aeroplanes of the period. The flying boats opened up the empire, and they were ideally suited for long maritime patrols out over the sea. And the Sunderland was the epitome of that.
Cliff decided he had to move overseas. In December 1938, with 2,400 flying hours under his belt, he sailed for England on the Moreton Bay, just 4 months after Ogwen George on the other side of the world had joined the RAF.
And then one day he said, "I want to see you. I've got something to tell you." So I said, "Well, look, I can't meet you till after my lecture at night." I think it was about a 6 o'clock lecture. He was waiting outside the university steps, and we went home together, and he told me he was going to England. He said, "Oh, look, you better forget about me. I won't be back for a long time." I said, "Oh, I just couldn't do that." So it was very short romance. It was very intense and very heartfelt on my side anyway. I think he meant it too.
Enclosed, a photo of a couple of Turks that were on the Moreton Bay. The one on the left is the Western Australian Rhodes Scholar. The other, I think, is an aviator from Australia, Cliff.
Stopping at Malta in January 1939, Cliff noted that Britain's air defences seemed woefully outdated.
It seems like British stupidity not to have at least one decent fighter squadron based here to intercept any enemy until the fleet moves out of the harbour.
The RAF aircraft were 1932 vintage, but the civilian aircraft, an enormous modern airliner, impressed him mightily.
While we were in Malta, Imperial Airways' new 42-passenger 4-engine Ensign landed from India. We had a good look over the machine, and I can only describe it as being huge.
While there, Cliff continued to make his own luck when he located the chief pilot for Imperial Airways. When he arrived in England, this connection enabled him to become a second pilot for Imperials on the 25th of January 1939. And the opportunity to study advanced navigation. He was soon carrying mail and passengers internationally on the luxurious Empire flying boats on the Southampton to Singapore leg of the famous Kangaroo route to Rose Bay, Sydney.
Now, just a bit about the routine on the plane. It takes 2 to fly the plane, and each has his own job, and it's quite interesting. I call the captain Sir, and the rest of the crew call me Sir. We are treated like lords everywhere and go down with the passengers for breakfast and lunch in the air. 4-course meals with a steward. When you bear in mind that I've failed the second nav twice now and should not even be flying, it's all the more remarkable. Anyhow, I go off to Singapore in the morning for 3 weeks. Oh yes, I can swear in French, Italian, Greek and Egyptian now. It helps to get the plane away from the refuelling depots quickly. It's a long way from moths. Well, no more news. Give my love to everyone and tell them I'm still out of jail. Cliff.
On the long night flights, I often thought of my friend Cliff. He was always interested in aviation from the point of view of the unusual or adventure. I fear he would never have been happy as a gold-braided airline captain on a beaten track. Harry Purvis.
If he'd been spared, he would have gone on to be a captain of aircraft very quickly, and who knows what would have happened.
We were aware of things happening, but as well as hearing about them, we've met people who had come out of Germany and the things that have been happening to them there, and everyone seemed to feel that something had to be done sometime to curb this madness that was going on in Europe, but they didn't know sort of when it would be.
We landed at Basra and went off next morning before daybreak for Karachi. Whilst in the air, we picked up wireless messages from 2 squadrons of Blenheims that have been transferred east due to the crisis. I still think Hitler is trying a colossal bluff, but he'll have to climb down.
I think we felt it was inevitable, but we weren't sure when. And the further we pushed away into the future, the better. Everyone was for appeasement, negotiation to try and calm things down, because they still remember the First World War. In fact, only just recovering from the effects of it, I just said.
That no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Dear Mum, well, I'm afraid I was wrong. There is a war. I was pretty sure it wouldn't happen, but the only conclusion I can come to is that Hitler is definitely mad. The Germans have torpedoed a liner off the coast of England with over 1,000
My dear Cliff,
200 odd drowned.
What we have hoped and prayed would be settled by negotiation has failed, and now war declared. Oh, son, we feel dreadful about it. Where will it end? In the end, the world has to meet to solve problems. So do hope it can be done now before loss of life on either side. Send me postcards if nothing else possible, just to show me where you are. Receiving one will show me you are all right. God be with you, and protect you, son, in any duties you have to perform. I'm thinking of you all the time, as you mean all in all to me. We are all well. Much love, Mother.
Dear Mum, well, here's the news. I'm in the Air Force and this is how it happened. On the 5th instant, Imperials...
On the 27th of October, Cliff cabled his parents with the news that he was called up for active service.
Hope you don't get too much of a shock. I want to get confirmed, as that means I've got a job when the war is over.
He was amongst an elite, really. The flying boaters were the creme de la creme. And certainly in RAF terms, it appears that the best pilots, the best aircrew were sort of selected for flying boats. And so you had an excellence, really, in a very small fraternity.
I was actually at Lossiemouth when war broke out. And I always remember on the 3rd of September 1939, we were all marching down to the parade ground, and the chap in charge said, "Now, come on, lads, you're all war pilots now." And, you know, I hadn't thought of that.
My mother saw this notice in the paper from AWA to celebrate the completion of their building in York Street, and the tower on the top, which was the tallest building in Sydney, were offering a free cable to any address in England. So she said to me, "Well, why don't you send one to Cliff?" I said, "I don't know his address." She said, "Where do you think he'd be?" And I said, "Well, he always been around planes, and we had seen the Hendon Air Show on newsreels. So I thought, well, where there are planes, that's where Cliff will be." So I sent a telegram, "Mr. Cliff Carpenter, Hendon Airport," or Hendon Aerodrome, I think it was. Hendon Aerodrome, England. And he found him. And he started to write straight away, and I wrote back, and then a deluge of letters both ways continued.
This is where my uncle was posted in October 1939 when he joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve. It's called Milford Haven, and it's very calm, it's well protected, and it's an ideal base for flying boats.
They're quite safe, as we never fly high since we are spotting subs. And if we are attacked, which has not happened to date, we go down about 30 feet off the water and keep the attackers behind us. In the tail, there are 4 machine guns that fire at the same time. And as they're in a power-operated turret, you just can't miss. If anyone is foolish enough to come at us from horizontal behind, when he's about half a mile away, he'd get blown into the water suddenly by our slipstream. If he dives on us from the top, there are 2 gunners in the middle that could get him before he knew what had happened. And if he attacks from the front gunner can get him. So you see, it's a pretty good job as this kind of job goes.
The Battle of the Atlantic, I believe, was the most crucial of the Second World War. You lose the Battle of the Atlantic, you lose the war.
Churchill reckoned that it was more important than any other battle because this country depended entirely on supplies coming in across the Atlantic.
Sunderlands would go out individually to meet up with a convoy, plus say 22 merchant vessels, 2 or 3 escort vessels, and then they would just do circuits around this convoy. They might say fly 4 hours out, 4 hours on station around the convoy, 4 hours back, which would give them an hour or so's cushion in case they were diverted due to weather, etc. And they would just plod around and round the circuit.
You might have heard of a coastal command plane dropping a ton of bombs on a submarine 2 days ago. It was one from our squadron, and the sub was just going to fire into a convoy and would have sunk at least 2 cargo boats if it had fired. I have not been lucky yet, but will get a turn in due course.
Well, I felt it was important because I had friends in the merchant navy who was torpedoed in the Atlantic and died. Cliff was just the first of many, many friends I lost. And it didn't make it any easier when it went on and on.
Well, you just, something you had to live with. It was not unusual to be talking to you now and then tomorrow you go out and never come back, and that's the last I see of him. But, I think different people take it in different ways. As I say, it's just something you come to accept.
My bombing has not been too good, and in fact there is every possibility in anyone's bombing that the bomb will fall short or go over the target. Well, to make a cert of it, I made up a little gadget to put down a stick of bombs, and now they want me to do one for each boat, so I'm quite proud of myself.
There were these perceptions that it'd be, all over by Christmas. But in a coastal command terms, there was no phony war because they were out on patrol from 3rd of September. The first wartime patrol actually left here before war was declared on that Sunday, the 3rd of September 39. And they were on patrol all the time. And it was constant operations, constant activity. It was very, very demanding because they were such a small force.
Dear family, well, congratulations. This is my 28th birthday. It's a fine day with the ground covered with frost.
My dear Cliff, on Christmas Day we all went to Eleanora, and I do wish you could have seen the clubhouse. It was beautifully arranged and a huge Christmas tree.
Christmas dinner will be in the mess, and they have 80 turkeys to cook, so it ought to be okay.
Each table had special and different decorations, and ours was a real surprise. Knowing you were not here, they had a huge aeroplane hanging over our table, with Air Force coloured ribbons to each place. And all the paper caps at our table were blue Air Force caps. So Cliff, just this little touch brought you right to our table with us. Even the place cards were specially drawn aeroplanes and coloured in blue and silver. Heaps of love from all. Mother.
By now you have probably heard that I've proposed to Miss Isabel Wilson, and yesterday I received a cable that she has accepted.
He wrote to me and asked me if I'd marry him, and he wrote to my parents asking their permission, and I'd already met his sister, and apparently he wrote to his parents as well. And of course I said yes. At that time it was possible to get to England, but still dangerous, but he thought he could manage it somehow through his father's influence. And I said, well, I wasn't going to come until I'd had the graduation ceremony, which was usually held in February, and that was all right. And then it was put off for 3 months, till May, and in the meantime he was killed. So it was all over very quickly.
It's interesting that one of the official reports talks about this and says, in view of the efficiency with which the German Air Force occupied and operated from the Norwegian airfields, and the scale of air support given to the German ground forces, it's not surprising that this aircraft failed to return.
It was very, very sad in this particular case at Silling when it was the day of the occupation and they had their very important mission, and it was accomplished and they were on their way back to England, and they were shot down.
I believe it was, and you bandy about words like suicide mission, but it was one that the chances of return were very low, because you were going into an airspace which was totally dominated by the enemy, who had made a very swift advance into the country. And you were in a big Sunderland, which was a big target and slow-moving target.
They are a huge target, they're a slow target, and of course not as manoeuvrable as a fighter, because when we were flying down in the Bay of Biscay from Plymouth, you had to fly past the French coast, where all the French airfields had German fighters there, and pretty well any time you went down into the bay, you'd be picked up by German fighters.
Sometimes in war, you have to take the risk because the end justifies that.
In the afternoon of the 8th of April 1940, the call went out for volunteers. Cliff made up a crew of 10 who, under the captaincy of Flight Lieutenant Peter Kite, flew Sunderland L2168 from their base at Pembroke Dock to Holyhead in North Wales. They stayed the night and then early the following day flew to Invergordon on the east coast of Scotland. It was here, for reasons unknown, the crew changed to Sunderland L2167. It was suggested they write a note to their families, and Cliff, in typical spirit, noted that the mission could hold some danger and might mean a medal or a box. They took off to the east at 1:30 p.m. It was then that sealed orders were opened and passed among the crew. Proceed to Oslo. Reconnaissance.
The invasion of Norway must have come as a shock to everybody. To find out what was happening, they needed to send something over there. Sunderland was the obvious choice because it had the legs. They put that crew together, which ended up on 2167 very quickly. It was almost like, who's available? And they put a composite crew together.
Obviously both sides recognised the strategic importance of Norway in relation to the Swedish iron ore supplies. So there was an element of who was going to get there first.
Norway was vitally important to Germany because of its ice-free port of Narvik up near the Arctic Circle. Sweden was supplying iron ore to Germany, but its ports on the Baltic Sea iced up in winter. As a result, ore was transported by rail to Narvik and then by ship to Germany. Britain sought to halt this trade in order to cripple Germany's war economy.
That morning my father waked me, I think about 5 or 6 in the morning. The day was very misty. There was still snow on the ground, and I went out and I heard the rumbling of guns over at the Oslofjord.
The airport had already been taken by the Germans, and they were there with all their planes, embarking soldiers, and the soldiers were marching into Oslo.
I could see straight away that they had battleships there, they were discarding the troops there, they had destroyers and all the rest of it. Yes. Then it didn't dawn on it, or not on me anyway, it didn't dawn on me that there was anything going on, because it took a second or two and we did realise that they weren't German. See? It wasn't until I spotted the planes on the tarmac of that aerodrome that I saw the old swastika.
The principal role of the Sunderland was general reconnaissance. The eyes in the sky. It had an offensive role thrust upon it. It ended up with a Sunderland being sent into a heavily defended enemy area, and the consequences were very sad.
Well, the first intuition we had was the battery of flak from these ships, of course. We were hit. Something hit us anyway, and one of the galley was full of smoke, you know. And then it got worse and worse, of course, the fire, and one of the engines caught fire.
I see this great plane coming over the fjord. with 2 fighters. I know it was fighters, and I heard, and I still heard the guns, the 20 millimeter.
And they just kept chasing us. They came in from all directions then. When the fun started, all I can remember is firing guns this side, that side, running back and forth with them.
They had to climb so hard because they were in the fjord, and they had to climb to get up over this huge mountain, this Overskogen area. And when you're in a 4-engine plane and at least 1, and I understand 2 engines were starting to pack up, you can't pull such weight up over the mountain.
This Messerschmitt was firing on it. He was the only one left firing back. And the Messerschmitt hit him in the shoulder.
This plane was coming from east and was followed. The Messerschmitts came in from behind, fired. It turned over up on the side, and then it broke away and exploded.
He saluted the Messerschmitt pilot and said, "You've got me." And then, of course, it all blew up.
This is where it all ended for Cliff. It's strange to feel so emotional about someone you never knew, you'd heard of. I guess you knew your mother adored him, but he was just a name that I'd heard of. And when you come here, you just can't help feeling, especially coming from Australia, you know, it is half a world away. It's more than half a world. It's so far from anywhere. The crew of L2167 were not to know that German forces, supported by superior air power, had invaded Norway that very day. This act of aggression signalled the end of the phony war and the start of the 20th century's most extensive conflict.
I made a little sketch for my father, what I had seen. 2 days later, the papers told about this first meeting of real war.
First of all, we got the news that Norway had been invaded. And I knew somehow that he was connected with it. How, I didn't know, but I felt he was connected with it. Because he'd been flying sorties over the Atlantic, watching the shipping and such things. And I was sure something had happened. It was on the Tuesday in Norway, it was the Wednesday here. On the Saturday, it was my father's birthday, and Mother had 2 tables of cards, people for bridge. And the phone rang just as I was singing "Happy Birthday to You" to my father. And Mother went out and answered, and then she called him. And I thought it was something to do with business. And I said, "What is it?" "Oh, it's all right." And when the people had gone, she said, "Oh, Cliff's missing. Missing in action." I said, "No, he's dead." And so it proved to be.
Cliff's mother learnt there was one survivor from the crash of the Sunderland, and for over 6 months held on to the faint hope that it was her son. On the last day of 1940, she wrote to the International Red Cross.
Dear Sirs, we are seeking information of a member of the crew of a Sunderland flying boat shot down near Drammen in Norway. The following information would enable us to satisfy ourselves whether he is our son or not. 1. A personal description of him. 2. Had he a birthmark on his body and where? 3. Was he dark, fair, or bald? 4. Did he ever speak of Australia? 5. Did he regain consciousness? If so, did he give any other names by which we could identify him? 6. Is he Jack Clifford Carpenter of Sydney, Australia, born in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia? 7. Did he live or die? 8. If he died, tell me where and when. 9. If he is still alive, tell me if he is in hospital and what his present condition is.
But it was not to be. Radio operator Ogwyn George survived after falling 3,000 feet without a parachute, hitting trees and then unusually deep snow. Amazingly, he was rescued by local timber cutter Johan Broughton and spent 5 months in Drammen Hospital before seeing out the war as a POW in Germany.
I find it quite strange. It's almost like fate. We think we are a master of our own destiny, but if it wasn't for the fact that Johan Broughton walked up the mountain at 2 o'clock in the morning and just so happened to have found Grandad alive, what's the chances of that ever happening and then coming down, surviving in the hospital and then surviving 5 years in the prisoner of war camp? I'd be a genetic combination of somebody else. I wouldn't be who I am today. And that is just fate, really, isn't it, really? I find that quite remarkable, really, when you think of it like that.
But Bill, this story, this impression on a young boy has followed me all the life through. So I hope that Ogwyn's name can live on in Norway. So I called Ogwyn and asked, may I name my last boy Ogwyn? Oh, he sang in the phone. He was so pleased.
The L2167 story that's lived with me for 30 years. I set myself, not a challenge, but something it was a target to try and get a photograph of every member of the crew, of that one crew that were lost over Norway. It took me 20 years.
I felt his story should have been told. There was thousands of stories like it, didn't there? You've only got to hear of anyone who'd been in the war. There's a story behind every person who was lost. And this is why I was a bit reluctant to come with you. It was my secret. Norway's written on my heart. And always will be.
They were occupied for 5 years and they knew these boys had given their lives at such a young age, and I think they really respect that every single year. Small school children with their typical Norwegian wildflowers, placing them down, and I think they think that that's a very big honour as well.
Britain's attempts to halt the German actions in Norway and Europe were embarrassing failures. My uncle's war and that of his fellow crewmen, what history has called the phony war, was actually a time when there was a small ray of hope that it would all be over very soon.
About the war, England is tightening the blockade now and Hitler will have to do a lot of thinking. However, apart from air warfare, I don't think anything serious will develop.
He of course was wrong. More than 50 million people were to die in the cataclysm that was the Second World War. And 10,875 airmen, with their patiently acquired skills and dreams of going home, were to lose their lives in Coastal Command.
Now, my dears, here we are at Cliff's resting place. Seeing this spot, no one could be sad. The comfort any relative could gain from knowing a dear one could be in such a place, seeing we all at some time have to die. So for my peace of mind, and for your benefit and comfort, I'm so very glad I've lived long enough to come and see it. It is a comfort, and will be to you all to know of it. Some relatives do not know where or how their men died. I do hope the photos I've taken will let you see it clearly. It is all so beautiful,
Join us on Wednesday for Anzac Day and our extensive coverage of the march in each state, as well as the dawn services in Gallipoli and Villers-Bretonneux, and the commemoration at Lone Pine. Anzac Day, Wednesday on ABC1.